All right, I'll move along now to the second half of my presentation. It consists of parts 4, 5, and 6 that deal with Vietnam and Cuba. First up will be part 4. The Vietnam War from 1961 to May 1962, when the big lie started. This is the worst one we've got, isn't it? President Kennedy said after reading a very troubling report on Vietnam just 6 days after his inauguration. That report was written by this guy, General Edward Lansdale. He wanted to be the US ambassador to South Vietnam, but he would never be stationed in Vietnam until JFK was no longer in the White House. I want to mention the Laos Annex to the Vietnam Task Force report that was issued on April the 27th, 1961. As I said in part 3 of my presentation this evening, by 27 April 1961, the Pentagon knew JFK would never intervene in Laos. And that night, the Pentagon inserted an annex into the Vietnam Task Force report. Authored by Lansdale, it was the first document ever to recommend sending US troops to Vietnam. Lansdale knew that Secretary of State Rusk had killed his dream of becoming the US ambassador to South Vietnam. But Lansdale was betting that the star rising on the horizon was intervention in Vietnam, and he would be correct, and he intended to be there when it happened. Just 2 weeks before Lansdale authored that annex to the Vietnam Task Force report, on April 1st, 61, Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick warned that the situation in South Vietnam was critical. He said the number of hardcore Viet Cong communists, VC, had tripled from 4,400 in early 1960 to 12,000 in April of 1961. Gilpatrick said Viet Cong forces were approaching the point where South Vietnam's army would be unable to cope. And he said 3,000 more Viet Cong had infiltrated through Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail into Vietnam since March 1961. From May through October 1961, President Kennedy was inundated with nonstop calls to send US combat troops to Vietnam. The struggle that erupted over combat troops in April continued unabated and parallel to the concomitant nuclear-tinged Berlin crisis and with growing domestic racial unrest in America. President Kennedy pushed aside all the calls from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to send combat troops. Upset by the intense pressure to intervene, JFK decided he had to act. So in October, he sent General Maxwell Taylor, his military advisor, to Vietnam, and JFK ordered him to return with a recommendation against sending US combat troops to Vietnam. But when Taylor returned, Kennedy wasn't happy. Taylor returned with a strange proposal to send 8,000 US combat troops to Vietnam under a, quote, flood release task force cover. Shocked and angry, President Kennedy tried to recall all copies of the final report. JFK even planted false stories in the papers that implied Taylor had not endorsed sending US combat troops. One result of Taylor's proposal was that JFK would cross swords with General Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. For President Kennedy, Taylor's proposal was the last straw. In the intense debate that followed, the key meeting occurred on 15 November 1961. The president asked Lemnitzer how he could justify this proposal for Vietnam while at the same time ignoring Cuba. Lemnitzer bluntly and even impudently replied that the Joint Chiefs still felt that even at this point, the US should go into Cuba. National Security Action Memorandum 111. On 22 November 1961, JFK drew a line in the sand on Vietnam with NSAM 111, pictured here. It contained no combat troops and no guarantees to save Vietnam from communism. President Kennedy did agree to a significant increase in American advisors and equipment, but he would not go beyond this commitment at any point during the rest of his presidency. So what was behind Kennedy's astute judgment in the issuing of NSAM 111? Well, we know from the Berlin crisis that JFK was willing to go to war for the right reason in Berlin, and that for him getting mired in Vietnam could trigger a much bigger war in Europe. So Kennedy turned down combat troops in Vietnam, not when his decision was clouded by ambiguities and contradictions in the reports from the battlefield, but when the battle was unequivocally desperate, when all concerned agreed that Vietnam's fate hung in the balance, and when his principal advisors told him that vital US interests in the region and the world were at stake. President Kennedy's Thanksgiving massacre over Vietnam policy. 3 days after Thanksgiving on 26 November, President Kennedy shook up the State Department to kneecap those promoting intervention in Vietnam. The next day, on 27 November, JFK invited Allen Dulles on his last day as the Director of Central Intelligence to the White House to witness another shakeup over Vietnam policy. And I'll get to that one shortly. Later that same day, on 27 November, the president gave a short speech to a small swearing-in ceremony for the new Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. JFK concluded with this remark: "We want to welcome you here and to say that you are now living on the bullseye, and I welcome you to that spot." Still on November 61, after those personnel purges, JFK laid down the law in Vietnam. An unusual group of officials were called to another meeting in the White House, some who had been fired and some who were their replacements. Once JFK entered the room, he vented his frustration over the lack of support for his Vietnam policy. JFK declared, quote, "Once policy is decided, people on the spot must support it or get out." And the president demanded to know who in the Pentagon would be personally responsible for implementing his program. Secretary of Defense McNamara answered, "Myself and L," meaning Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. McNamara takes charge. That very night, McNamara returned to the Pentagon to lay out the plan for what he called Operation Beef Up, many military actions to boost the war effort in South Vietnam. On 16 December, at his first Secretary of Defense SecDef conference, he set forth 3 tenets. First, we have great authority from President Kennedy. Second, money is no object. Third, no combat troops will be sent to Vietnam. The Military Assistance Command, MACV, was created as a subordinate command of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, CINCPAC. General Maxwell Taylor's old friend and protege, General Paul D. Harkins, became the first MACV commander on the 2nd of January, 1962. A few days later, Lemnitzer sent his most audacious memorandum to President Kennedy. On 13 January 62, McNamara sent the memo to JFK saying he didn't endorse it. It was a long, insubordinate diatribe that was essentially saying this: "We told you a year ago to send combat troops to Vietnam, but you didn't listen. We've done everything you asked for in your program, and if it falls apart, we still want to send in combat troops. And if you fail to do it then, it will only make our job more difficult when we have to do it anyway." There was alarming news about the Viet Cong's forces surging at the second SecDef conference on 15 January. 2 days after Lemnitzer's demeaning dig at President Kennedy, the review of the enemy situation at the second SecDef conference revealed that hardcore Viet Cong strength had risen to 20,000 or 25,000. Now, U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine then and now holds that a minimum 10-to-1 ratio is required to contain an insurgency. 5 soldiers in static defense for cities and infrastructure, and a minimum of 5-to-1 in the offense. Thus, with just 160,000 men in South Vietnam's army, it could only contain a Viet Cong force of 16,000. A VC force of 25,000 men required an army of 250,000 men just to contain them. The third SecDef conference on 19 February 62, yet another controversy over the Viet Cong. This time, their numbers happened. Colonel Winterbottom, who was the head of intelligence at MACV, showed several slides on Viet Cong strength ranging from 18,000 to 27,000. Lemnitzer piped up and said, "It makes it look like we're losing." But when McNamara asked why there was such a discrepancy, Colonel Winterbottom replied that the analysis personnel lacked the required training. Almost falling out of his chair with anger, Lemnitzer scolded Winterbottom for this assertion. But his patience at its end, Secretary of Defense McNamara demanded a requirements list and declared this intelligence problem must be solved. And at this point, what happened was a sudden reversal in military reporting on the war in Vietnam. What I call the beginning of the optimistic interlude. Our first clue about this also occurred at the third SecDef conference by the MACV commander, General Harkins. In the order of battle uproar that had taken place, scant attention was paid to General Harkins' surprising opening remarks about a spirit of optimism and growing confidence in Vietnamese and U.S. military and civilian circles. McNamara and others passed on this rosy news to House Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committees on Capitol Hill when he got back. But this early optimism was still in stark contrast to the conclusions of U.S. intelligence community estimates. How could it be that there was optimism at this point? It was only a month since Lemnitzer had told President Kennedy that nothing short of 6 U.S. combat divisions in Vietnam could prevent a communist takeover from New Delhi to Tokyo, not just Vietnam. In Vietnam, very few of the new American advisors had even arrived in country yet. And even those were still awaiting assignments. And it was long before President Kennedy's new program had any chance to affect the tide of battle in Vietnam. So what was it? What we do know is that this new optimistic interlude would not end until 20 November 1963, 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy. So MACV analysts were augmented by the best military and civilian experts on Vietnamese order of battle issues in the world to prepare to brief McNamara of what he wanted the intelligence problem to be solved. That would take place from 8 to 11 May 1962 at the 5th SecDef conference in Saigon. For 6 weeks, the order of battle team had crawled across Vietnam's 44 provinces and found there were 40,000 or more Viet Cong, hardcore Viet Cong, to report to McNamara at the conference in Saigon. The briefing that took place in front of him falsely claimed there were only 16,500 hardcore Viet Cong. The exact number, of course, that the 170,000 man South Vietnam Army would be able to handle. But not only were the forces cut by that stark amount, but the briefing also falsely claimed that the South Vietnamese army was crushing the Viet Cong on the battlefield. Afterward, McNamara, on the tarmac at the airport, said he was tremendously encouraged and that every quantitative assessment shows that we are winning the war. For the next several slides, we will take a look at the truth about the war in Vietnam and why that truth only made it through a secret back channel to Vice President Lyndon Johnson, not to McNamara and Kennedy. From the moment General Harkins, the MACV commander, lied about how swimmingly things were going at the Third SecDef conference, a covert scheme to hide the truth about the war from JFK had been put into play. This secret back channel memo from LBJ's military aide, Colonel Howard Burris, shows that growing Viet Cong battalion echelon attacks were underway. In mid-February, a false stream of data on the numbers of hardcore Viet Cong began flowing to JFK through McNamara, while a truthful stream of data flowed to Vice President Johnson through his aide Burris. The motive behind the false story was to prevent President Kennedy from pulling out of Vietnam early. In 1991, Burris told me in an interview that Lyndon Baines Johnson told him to find out what the hell was going on. But LBJ never mentioned this seditious activity in his memoirs or any other public venue. At this time, the president and the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, were consumed by the struggle with Lemnitzer over Cuba. We'll get to that in the next presentation, part 5. So McNamara and JFK were asleep at the switch at this point on the Vietnam misdirection campaign. This March 1962 extract, pictured here from a Burris memorandum, is full of clues about what was going on. McNamara didn't know what Burris was up to, while Burris knew all about McNamara's meetings. Burris had been talking with the Joint Staff and with General Taylor's office. This suggests General Taylor knew about the false info being fed to JFK and did not tell him about it either. Burris's marginalia in this March 62 memo suggests that McNamara was not sure what was really going on. McNamara thought he could get some answers at the conferences, but the answers were fabrications. What this handwriting says is in Burris is writing this to LBJ. This same question of where we are in South Vietnam still disturbs Mr. McNamara. He's leaving today, March 20th, for meetings in Honolulu, where he hopes to get some answers. Yeah, well, he got answers all right, fabrications. McNamara and JFK, as I said before, were distracted by the growing power struggle over Cuba. As we're leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. One thing was certain, Burris was making sure that LBJ had the latest true information on the deception of JFK about the battlefield situation in Vietnam. As McNamara waited for the upcoming account to him of the size of the Viet Cong, they were rapidly increasing the intensity of their attacks. This March 1962 secret Burris memo to LBJ reveals that the monthly losses sustained by the South Vietnamese army were staggering. The Viet Cong were now challenging regular units of South Vietnamese army in the field. When I interviewed Burris in 1991 and asked him where he got his information, he hinted that it was from US Army intelligence. And this slide is proof that he's right about that, at least partially. Burris had access to secret US Army Pacific intelligence bulletins. USARPAC was underneath the command of CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific. On the left of your screen, you see the USARPAC monthly intelligence bulletins. And on the right side of the screen, you're seeing a 16 April memo from Burris to the vice president. And they have exactly the same figures down to the nth degree. USARPAC raw data was coming from United States Army intelligence units in Vietnam. And they were saying in March 62 that there were 1,861 Viet Cong attacks. And the same exact figure was used in Burris's April 16th memo to LBJ. At no other place do you find these exact figures. They were released, by the way, to me when I made a request to the Army Center for Military History. That's why it says the Newman papers. They're all now stored up in the JFK library. In the picture, in the front of that picture is Don Blasek. He was a librarian, retired at the time, at the Army Military Intelligence School in Arizona, where I was attending the Military Intelligence Advanced Course in 1988. When we met, and he discovered that my PhD dissertation was on JFK and Vietnam, he told me about how the Vietnam order of battle had been completely corrupted in 1962. He said, that's when the big lie started. He was there when it happened, and he gave me the names of the officers who were forced to cut the figures by General Harkins and Colonel Winterbottom. Don Blasek also said that a former CI officer in Virginia, living in Virginia, Sam Adams, would tell me how to contact them. When I returned to the National Security Agency for my next assignment, I had a long visit with Sam Adams on his farm, Loudon Farm in Virginia. Later, in the mid-1960s, Sam Adams was the one who discovered that MacV was lying. This is under the when Westmoreland was there in 65, 6, and 7. MacV was lying about the size of the Viet Cong then. That's why Blasek told me that 1962 was when the big lie got started. In 1988, when I had my interview with Adams, he told me that two experienced order of battle specialists named George Allen and Bill Benedict were sent to Saigon after MacNamara ordered MacV to find out the actual size of the Viet Cong. Now, the results of their 6 weeks of work I mentioned before were not presented to McNamara at the May 62 SecDef conference. Their VC strength figures were drastically cut, and Allen and Benedict were kept under house arrest until McNamara had been briefed and had left Saigon. Now, the nice gentleman who gave me the USERPEC intelligence summaries asked me if I also wanted him to declassify the so-called measles map. I hadn't heard of that yet. Anyway, the measles map was shown to McNamara during the 11th May briefing. Of course, I said yes. Although MacV had cut most of the VC units, they had forgotten to change what you're looking at here, which was on a 4x8 plywood display made by Benedict and Allen. The night before McNamara's briefing, there was a command rehearsal. And when they walked in, Harkins saw this map and he exclaimed, "Oh my God, we can't show that to McNamara." And in front of the MacV senior officers in this rehearsal, Harkins directed Winterbottom peel off the scariest overlays of Viet Cong force locations. And what you're looking at is the falsified version of the measles. It already looks pretty bad here, but it was much worse. And I will have to tell you that this has been confirmed by other people that I met at NSA. The NSA representative there saw that. He was present. He saw what they did. And others have talked about it too, including a CIA chief of intelligence, director of the CIA told me the same story because he was there at the time. And so here you can see pictured the actual portion of the report given to McNamara during that conference, the brief from the briefing book. MacV cut VC forces from over 40,000 to just 16,000 and hatched a huge lie about the battlefield situation. General Harkins showed South Vietnam data for 6 weeks from 21 March to 7 May, but he only showed the Viet Cong data for 3 weeks from 14 April to 7 May. Now you don't have to get your slide rule out, but you would need to look at this slide a couple of times to see what's missing. The missing Viet Cong data from 21 March to 14 April was a countrywide and the largest offensive, Viet Cong offensive of the war to date, which is why it's missing from here. From 14 April to 7 May, the Viet Cong were regrouping to replace their dead and wounded and to refit their forces with new weapons. And why? Because here is from the USAPAC intelligence bulletins. This is a map of that period leading up to McNamara's SecDef conference in May. And this is what was missing, but they didn't show him. And if you look at it, just about all those spots along the map there, most all of them are battalion size Viet Cong attacks. And where are they attacking? Not just one place, but the length and the breadth of the entirety of South Vietnam, and especially around Saigon and the Delta below. I found an interview with Alan and Benedict in 1998. They had never seen or talked to each other since 1962. When they confirmed everything that Adams and Blasek told me, I knew I had the Army to release this these monthly intelligence bulletins. And they did, as you can see here, what Harkins hid from McNamara, the enormous Viet Cong offensive that ended just 3 weeks before McNamara's briefing in Saigon. Now, I want to end this section by stating that the myth of battlefield success was in Vietnam was manufactured to prevent JFK from pulling out of Vietnam. But remember, as we'll see in the next part coming up, at the same time all this was going on, in March and April of 1962, General Lemnitzer was trying to push Kennedy into a war in Cuba, where the USSR was preparing to introduce offensive nuclear missiles.